The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the sky looked so ordinary, just gray and flat the way it always gets in Mississauga before the first real snow. I was driving home from my shift at the dental clinic, where I worked as an office coordinator. Nothing unusual about the day. I had a roast chicken defrosting on the counter at home, a pile of unread mail on the kitchen table, and a voicemail from my mother I hadn't gotten around to returning. That was the last thing I remember before the black SUV ran the red at Dundas and Erin Mills and hit my car on the driver's side. I woke up in Trillium Health Partners with a fractured collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, and a bruised spleen. My husband Connor was sitting in the chair beside my bed when I opened my eyes. He was on his phone. He didn't look up right away. I want to be fair when I tell this story. I want to be the kind of person who remembers only the important things and lets the small ones go. But I remember that. I remember lying there with tubes in my arm and a pain in my chest that made it hard to breathe. And I remember watching him scroll through something on his phone for a full 20 seconds before he noticed I was awake. "Hey," he said. "You're back." Like I'd been out for a walk. I was 31 years old. We had been married for 4 years. We had a daughter named Poppy who was 2.5, and who was at home with Connor's mother, Ruth. And I had a sister named Vivian who lived 40 minutes away in Oakville, with her husband and their 2 boys. My parents lived in Hamilton. 20-minute drive down the 403 if you hit the lights right. I was in the hospital for 9 days. My mother came twice. My father came once on the 4th day, stayed for 45 minutes, and spent most of it talking to Connor in the hallway. My sister texted every morning, "Thinking of you." Sending only came on day 7. And she brought the boys, which meant she spent most of the visit managing them, instead of sitting with me. I told myself it was fine. People are busy. Life doesn't stop because you're lying in a hospital bed. But here is what I didn't know yet, what I was only beginning to suspect, was that their absence wasn't busyness. It was calculation. My grandmother on my mother's side, Grandma Loretta, had passed away the previous spring. She left behind a house in Burlington, a modest but paid-off property worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million depending on which real estate agent you asked. She also left behind a savings account and 2 GICs that together came to roughly $240,000. And she left it all, every single cent of it, to me. Not to my mother, not split between me and Vivian, to me alone. Grandma Loretta had her reasons. She never stated them formally, but I understood. I was the one who drove to Burlington every Sunday for 4 years while she was declining. I was the one who took her to her rheumatology appointments and her hearing aid fittings and her grocery runs. I was the one sitting with her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening when she said she wanted to change her will, and I was the one who drove her to her lawyer's office the following week, sat in the waiting room while she did it, and drove her home again. I didn't ask to be included. I certainly didn't ask to be the sole beneficiary. It surprised me when her estate lawyer read out the will in June. It surprised me so much I started crying in his office. It did not surprise my mother nearly as much as she pretended it did. By the time I was lying in that hospital bed in November, the estate was still in probate. The lawyer had explained it would take several more months. There was nothing to sign, nothing to transfer, nothing to contest. Not yet. But everyone in my family knew what was coming. Everyone knew that the house in Burlington and the money in those accounts were eventually going to land in my name. And I think that's when I started to become inconvenient. It was my husband's mother, Ruth, who first said something that made me pause. She came to the hospital on day 5, ostensibly to drop off a change of clothes and some of Poppy's drawings. Poppy had made me a picture of a rainbow with purple clouds, which I stuck on the wall beside the window and looked at every day until I was discharged. Ruth sat down and smoothed her pants and asked how I was feeling, and then she said, almost casually, "Connor tells me you'll be off work for a while." "A few weeks," I said. "Maybe 6. The collarbone needs time." She nodded slowly. "And the house? You'll need help there. I'm hoping my mom can come for a bit." Ruth looked at her hands. "Of course. Though I'm sure she's got her hands full with your father's back." She paused. "Vivian's still doing all that travel for work, isn't she?" Yes. "It's a shame," Ruth said, "that there isn't more support." And then she moved on to talking about Poppy, and the conversation shifted, and I didn't think much of it until later. Until I replayed it and realized she had been testing something. The evening of day 6, I woke up from a nap around 7 o'clock. The room was dim. I could hear voices in the hallway. My door was open a few inches. The nurses liked to leave it that way. And through that gap I could hear my mother's voice, and Connor's voice, and then my father saying something low and sharp that I couldn't quite make out. I lay very still. She's not going to be functional for months, Connor was saying. You've seen her, she can barely lift her arm. The girls need their mother, my mother said. That's not the question. Then what is the question? My father, clearer now. A pause, then Connor, quieter, the Burlington property, where the probate is still open. There might be a way to have a formal caregiver arrangement recognized before the transfer. Something that establishes that the estate is being collectively maintained. Patricia's firm handled something similar last year. Patricia. His law firm colleague. I knew who he meant. My mother's voice dropped. You'd have to do it before it clears. That's what I'm saying. The conversation moved off down the hallway and I lost the thread of it. I lay in the dark and stared at Poppy's rainbow on the wall and told myself I had misunderstood. That I was on painkillers and had been sleeping badly and was probably not parsing things correctly. That my husband was a good man and my parents loved me, and there was a reasonable explanation for everything I had just heard. I told myself that for 2 more days. Then I stopped. I was discharged on a Saturday. Connor brought the car and helped me to the curb slowly, carefully, one hand under my elbow. He was attentive in a way that felt performative. Not because I had proof of that, but because something in me had shifted and I was watching him differently now. My mother had offered to come and help for the first week. She arrived on the Monday, assessed the situation, made a pot of soup, and then announced on the Wednesday that she needed to get back because my father's physiotherapy schedule was complicated and she couldn't manage both. She left before lunch. I was not well enough to lift my daughter. I could not drive. I could not do laundry without wincing. The clinic had me off for 6 weeks and I was already running through my sick days. Connor worked long hours. He always had. I had accepted that about our marriage years ago and built my life around it. But there is a difference between a husband who works long hours because he's building something, and a husband who works long hours because he would prefer not to be home. I was only beginning to understand which one I had. Vivian called every few days. She was sympathetic over the phone. She suggested I look into hiring a home care worker through the province, which was actually useful advice. She did not offer to come. I hired a part-time PSW through a private agency because the public waitlist was months long. I paid for it out of my own savings. I started a careful, quiet accounting of everything I was spending, not because I was suspicious of anything specific yet, but because I had learned, somewhere in those 9 days in the hospital, to pay attention. My grandfather, my father's father, lived alone in a townhouse in Etobicoke. He was 78 years old, still sharp, still drove himself to his appointments, still tended a small plot in the community garden 2 streets over every summer. We had always been close, he and I, but the busyness of adult life had made our visits less frequent. A Sunday dinner here, a birthday call there. He called me 3 weeks after I got home from the hospital. Not a text. He called. How are you actually doing? He said. Not a question. The way he said it made it a different kind of sentence entirely. I started to say fine, and then I didn't. I told him the truth, not all of it. Not the conversation in the hallway, not the thing about Patricia and the Burlington property. Just the surface truth, which was that I was alone more than I should be, and managing more than I had expected and feeling, underneath it all, frightened in a way I couldn't fully explain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm coming on Saturday. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, he said. That's not the point. He arrived with a casserole, a bag of clementines, and his overnight bag. He stayed for 5 days. He lifted Poppy and read her stories and made her oatmeal in the morning and took her to the park in the afternoon so I could rest. He fixed the cabinet door in the kitchen that had been sticking for months. In the evenings after Poppy was in bed, he sat with me at the kitchen table and talked, really talked, about things I had not said out loud to anyone. On the 3rd evening I told him about the hallway. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, Walk me through the will again. Everything your grandmother's lawyer told you. I did. He nodded slowly. He had this way of nodding when he was thinking. Small, deliberate, like he was filing things away. You need a lawyer, he said, not the estate lawyer, your own lawyer. You think they'd actually try to. I think, he said carefully, that people make very poor decisions when large sums of money are involved. And I think you have not been given the luxury of being naive about that. I sat with that for a moment. Connor, I said. I don't know, he said. That's what a lawyer would help you figure out. I found a family law lawyer in Mississauga through a referral from a woman at my clinic, another coordinator who had gone through a difficult separation 2 years earlier. Her name was Miriam, and she had a manner that was brisk and humane in equal measure, which was exactly what I needed. The will, the probate timeline. The name of the colleague Connor had mentioned, the rough outline of what I had heard in that hospital hallway. She listened. She asked careful, specific questions. She made notes. "The conversation you overheard," she said. "Do you know if anything was filed?" "I don't know. We should find out," she said. "Before the estate clears probate, there are a limited number of mechanisms someone could use to insert themselves into the distribution. A dependence relief claim, a constructive trust argument. None of these are straightforward, but they're possible. Could my parents make a claim? Dependence relief in Ontario applies primarily to spouses and children. Your parents would have an uphill battle. But a spouse. She looked at me steadily. A spouse has more options. That was the first time I said it out loud. The possibility I had been circling for weeks without naming. "You think my husband might try to contest the estate?" "I think," she said, in that brisk and careful way, "that you should understand your position before he does." Miriam filed a request through the courts to flag any third-party motions against the estate. Within 2 weeks we had our answer. Connor's firm, not him personally, but a partner at the firm with whom he was closely associated, had filed a preliminary motion arguing that the estate represented a family asset under certain provisions of Ontario family property law, and that given my recent incapacitation, there was grounds to argue that management of the estate should be deferred pending a full review of our family's financial circumstances. Miriam read the filing to me over the phone. I sat in the kitchen with Poppy drawing at the table beside me, and I felt something go very still inside me. Not grief, not rage, just clarity. All of it arranged itself suddenly. The hospital visit, my parents' quick departure, the conversation about Patricia, Ruth's careful probing that afternoon in my room, the weeks of distance that had felt like busyness but was actually something else entirely. I had been alone in that hospital not because people were busy. I had been alone because they were calculating. "What do we do?" I said. "We respond," Miriam said, "and we make sure the estate executor is aware of this motion and has independent counsel." "Whose name is on the executor designation?" "Mine." "Good," she said. "That's very good." The next month was not easy. I want to be honest about that. I was still healing physically. My collarbone ached in the cold, and November in Mississauga was very cold. Poppy was going through a difficult phase with sleep, and I was spending 2 or 3 hours in the night with her, because I didn't have the heart to let her cry alone, and Connor was rarely home before 9. I was living on PSW hours and casseroles my grandfather kept bringing in his little cooler bag, and the particular grinding effort of getting through each day without falling apart. Connor and I were still living together. We were still going through the motions of a marriage. We were very polite to each other in a way that felt like standing on ice. Neither of us wanted to crack first. I did not tell him about Miriam. My parents called occasionally. My mother's conversations had a quality I recognized now. A careful circling around the subject of money, an occasional probing question about how I was managing the estate process, how long probate typically took. I answered vaguely. I changed the subject. I was learning to be a different kind of person than I had been before the accident. Less open, more watchful. I wasn't sure yet if that was growth or grief. My grandfather came every Saturday. He and Poppy had developed a ritual around building train tracks on the living room floor, an elaborate circuit that wound around the furniture legs and required very specific placement of the little wooden bridges. I would make tea and sit on the couch and watch them, and sometimes I would cry a little, quietly, because it was the only time all week that I felt safe. The motion was heard in court in early January. Miriam had done thorough work. She had documented the timeline of the estate, my years of caregiving for my grandmother, the explicit designation in the will, and the specific legal distinction between inheritance and family property under Ontario law. She had also, with the estate lawyer's cooperation, established that no spousal assets had been commingled with the estate. There was no joint account, no shared title, nothing that would support a claim that the inheritance was a family resource rather than my individual property. Connor's firm's argument, it turned out, was thinner than it had sounded on paper. The motion was dismissed. I found out on a Tuesday as the accident, which I noticed and decided not to read too much into. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Miriam's office and called my grandfather. "It's done," I said. "They dismissed it." He exhaled a long, slow breath. "Okay," he said. "Good, I'm going to have to deal with Connor now. I know. I don't know how." "Yes, you do," he said. "You've known for a while. You were just waiting to be safe enough to do it." That was true. I had known since December, maybe earlier. But Miriam had advised me to wait until the estate matter was resolved, and I had listened to her, and she had been right. I filed for separation in February. Connor did not take it quietly. He hired his own lawyer, not a partner from his firm this time, a private family lawyer. And we went through several months of back and forth about property division, about Poppy, about the support arrangements. It was exhausting and expensive, and there were days when I questioned whether I had the endurance for it. My mother, when I told her about the separation, was silent for a long moment and then said, "This is going to complicate everything." She meant the estate. She meant that a divorce might open different kinds of claims. She was probably right, which was why Miriam and I had planned carefully. My father sent me a long email about the importance of keeping the family intact. He used the word stability 6 times. Vivian called and said she was sorry and that she had always thought Connor was a bit much. I wasn't sure what to do with that. None of them asked how I was. My grandfather asked every time. The estate cleared probate in April. The house in Burlington transferred to my name, and Grandma Loretta's accounts were released according to her directions. I sat with my grandfather at his kitchen table in Etobicoke the evening it was finalized, and he made tea and we didn't talk about money at all. We talked about my grandmother, the real one, his wife, who had died when my father was still in high school. He talked about her the way people talk about someone when they've been carrying the memory of them carefully for decades, turning it over, keeping it intact. "She would have liked you," he said. "You've said that before." "Still true," he said. I drank my tea. Outside the window, the garden plot down the street had started to show the first green of spring, a few tulip shoots coming up through the mud. I thought about the version of me who had been lying in that hospital room in November, watching my husband scroll his phone, telling myself everything was fine. I thought about how long I had known things were not fine and how long it had taken me to stop pretending otherwise. I thought about how the accident, the most frightening and painful thing that had ever happened to me, had ultimately done me the strange favor of making everything clear. "I'm thinking about using some of the money to take a course," I said. The dental clinic offered to sponsor me for a practice management certificate. Combined with what I can put in, I could have my own clinic in a few years. My grandfather looked at me over his mug. "Tell me about it," he said, and I did. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I talked about what I wanted, not what I was managing, not what I was surviving, but what I actually wanted, and he listened the way he always had, like it was the most important thing happening in the world. Outside, the tulips kept coming up, slowly and without apology and all at once.